Hello and welcome to this edition of Google Firestarters. I'm Neil Perkin, the curator of Firestarters and also the founder of consultancy business Only Dead Fish. So for the uninitiated, Google Firestarters is a series of conversations with the interesting and interested of the advertising and marketing community, focusing really on the areas of challenge and opportunity in the industry. And these conversations really build off the back of about 60 live events that we ran over 10 years at Google. And we always structure the conversation around the same 5 questions. So what's the best thing you've learned? What's the biggest mistake that you've made? Your key insight around how the industry, marketing and advertising is changing, key predictions for the future, and then our final catch-all question, which is what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you? So today's guest is both interesting and interested. So I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Salter. So Sarah is the global head of applied innovation at WPP agency Wavemaker. And Sarah, I wonder if you could just kick off, maybe if you could tell us a bit more about your role.
For sure. Thanks for the intro, Neil. So my role as applied innovation is to drive emerging technologies and disruptive media and marketing technologies into clients to give them an unfair growth advantage, essentially. I've spent most of my career client side, working for brands like P&G and Casio and Equinox. And what I really learned there was the need for new, more innovative growth strategies. And that's really where I help our clients today.
Fantastic, thank you. I'd love to talk to you a bit more, obviously, about that. So let's come to our first question, shall we? So I'd love to understand across your career, working in different agencies and so on, what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date?
I think probably the most helpful thing that I learned is that every person, every interaction could be an opportunity. And if it's not an opportunity, you'll never regret talking to a nice person. And I've kind of taken that through my career, and I guess to extreme in that I have a rule to take at least 3 new meetings a week with new people, new businesses, where I hope to learn about something new. And sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, but it's incredible how most of those interactions end up being incredibly relevant or helpful in some way. And I think what this has really helped me with is it's helped take me on a path of learning. It's helped me make incredible friends and relationships along the way, and it's helped take me to really unexpected places. So an example of that is I was working for a brand in New York, and I was feeling incredibly burnt out at the end of a week, and there was an event on which I had RSVP'd for, and I tried to never let anybody down if I said I will attend, and I forced myself to go even though I was incredibly exhausted. And actually what I found that day was I was sat next to my future boss, and had effectively an informal interview for a role that I started a few months later. And I think it just really shows the power of conversations and staying curious and meeting new people. It can just take your life in incredibly new and interesting places.
I mean, I love that thought about the idea of sort of continuous learning and taking meetings just for the purposes of learning, really, which is so interesting. I think one of the things that I'd like to ask you actually is, as a head of innovation, there's so much happening, I think, really in media and outside of media now, which is interesting. How do you know where to go? Because there's so many different sort of paths and technologies and things happening. So with that curiosity, how do you know which path to follow?
You don't always, is I think one of the answers. And actually, by staying curious, it can often take you to a new idea that you wouldn't have thought of, or it might not have felt relevant. You often also get ideas and areas that aren't of interest. I do try and stay incredibly strategic and focused on what it is that our clients are looking for, as well as having an eye on the future. So if I'm honest, my 7-year-old kid is probably the person who leads me to take most meetings, how he communicates, the things that he's into. I'm like, okay, I need to keep an eye on this and look at this. So, it generally is being really, really aligned strategically to what I believe the most disruptive and innovative technologies may be. Or if not, just exploring and staying curious to see where it might take me in the future.
And just building on that, when you're sort of exploring a new technology or a new area, how do you really understand where the potential value is for clients if it's still a really emerging technology?
I mean, it's very client specific, I guess, in terms of where the value might be. And most of the time it comes from a future vision or a consumer insight, with how a consumer's interacting with their product at the moment, and how that technology might change or affect how they might interact with it in the future. So again, it's incredibly strategic and focused on kind of where our clients are focused and where the consumers are spending time.
And what about the idea of fads, I suppose? So things that sort of come and go, and you get a sort of sharp spike of attention and lots of people talking about it, and then a year later nobody's talking about it. So how can you tell the difference between a trend, something which is really here to stay, and perhaps something which is a bit more of a fad?
Test and learn, experiment. And I think, that's one of the things that I try and encourage all of my clients to do is you don't know what you don't know, right? It could be a fad, it might be the next biggest thing. And unless you actually test the water and just start to pilot in those spaces, then you'll never really know. I think probably I can't go without mentioning the latest probably buzzword around metaverse and the latest area that everybody's talking about. And all of our clients want to hear about it. All of them want to know what their role is in it. And it's essentially an area that's still being built and still being developed. So without experimenting in it and testing in it, you're never going to know where your brand has a role to play in that space. So I'll never talk about a fad for the sake of talking about a fad. I'll talk about it as this is the prediction. So this is the space that we can start to test and learn in. And I think that's the difference, right? In my very long title of applied innovation, I think where I always struggled as a client with agency was innovation was always so future focused and never felt very real or tactical or tangible for my business at the time. And so what I try to do is develop a really clear process for how it can be applicable to your business and how you can start testing and learning in that space now.
That's so interesting, actually, about what you're saying there about making it practical, applicable, and just creating that sort of liminal space, I suppose, that where agencies can partner with clients. I mean, do you think there is a real role here for agencies to do that for clients, to perhaps challenge them, to create the spaces and processes to enable them to experiment with some of these new technologies?
For sure. I mean, I think it all comes down to, the relationships, the openness of the client and matching, their fears and their strategies and where they're going. And I think quite often I'd have agencies come in and talk to me about a particular area that one didn't feel relevant to my business, or two just felt so huge and transformative that I didn't even know where to start. And I think a huge piece is education, right? Let's start by educating each other about what these new technologies might change, might enable. And from there, we can start to understand where to go and place our bets. Because it is bets, essentially. There are, like you said at the beginning, there are a huge number of new technologies, and it's balancing out the risk of trialing one area versus the need to grow your consumer base and be in that space.
Fantastic. So let me come to my second question now, because maybe this is related to fad and trend, I don't know. But the biggest mistake that you've made in your career, what was that, and what did you learn from it?
I mean, I've probably made a fair number of mistakes being in innovation. If you don't, then you definitely aren't really in innovation. But I probably would take a personal mistake. And I think for me, that was in my early 20s. I think when you get very confident in a particular role, you kind of stop learning. You become quite complacent. You stop listening. You don't evolve your skill set in possibly the way that you should. And I think I definitely, in my early 20s, had that error. You know, I assumed that my past successes would take me into the future, and I think it's a lesson I've never made again. And I remember meeting a peer who I'd been at university with, and we were at an event together, and her skill set was so impressive. And she read every day, she upskilled herself every day, she challenged thinking, and it was incredibly eye-opening for me. And I think, you know, it took me a few months of hard work to bring myself back up to date on things that I might have missed. But, you know, that probably has been a really big catalyst for my career. And I've probably taken it to the extreme working in innovation, because learning has effectively become the core reason for my being and my career. And it's what excels me and gets me out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I often think actually it's quite an enviable position to be in, isn't it? Just being at the sort of cutting edge of things and just always needing to learn, I guess, for your job. But what you say there, I think, is interesting, because again, it goes back to that point that you were saying at the beginning about building in continuous learning and, you know, taking sort of meetings and so on, and maybe just making it more of a habit, I suppose. Is that really what it's about? Just building it in so it is a habitual behavior, so that you are always learning and always moving forwards and always progressing?
For sure. And also, I think one of the challenges that we have in our industry is we've become quite siloed in an industry. And, you know, for me, I've always wanted to experience everything. You know, I want to work at a brand. I worked at a startup. I've worked at an agency. And the people that sit outside those silos are the most interesting and exciting people, and really have something to bring to, you know, our clients and what it is that we talk to consumers about. And so for me, you know, that's such a huge part of it, is reducing the silos, you know, staying curious, looking in new places for inspiration. You know, everybody's reading, you know, TechCrunch, Business of Fashion, you know, all of the same things. And if we're all reading all of the same things, then we're all going to be saying all of the same things. So for me, it's about looking outside for inspiration and bringing that in.
And do you ever get sort of questioned on that at all? I'm just curious to know if you know, things perhaps you're meeting people that are not immediately relevant to perhaps media, or maybe you're exploring sort of ideas which are not that tangible at the moment. Does that ever get questioned, or, you know, why are you spending time doing this at all?
It always is relevant. You know, we have such a huge, diverse selection of clients that actually, in some way, there will always be a relevance or an interest. It might be cars, it might be CPG. You know, there's a way to bring something in. I think it's just understanding a client's business enough to know what the relevance is. Of course, if there's no relevance, I wouldn't bring it in. But I think most of the time, outside views are always incredibly well received by our clients, and challenging their thinking is always incredibly well received, right? You know, especially in innovation, everybody is always pitching the latest tech solution, or, you know, the latest disruptive marketing model, and you know, to come in and just make somebody think a bit different for half an hour, who wouldn't like that, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've talked a lot already about being at the cutting edge of the industry. In fact, I think Campaign actually called you one of the UK advertising industry's most well-known authoritative voices on innovation in media and advertising. So I'd love to ask you a bit about your views on how you think the industry itself is changing. So you're welcome to take whatever spin you like on that. But what are the big ways in which the industry is changing, do you think?
That is a very big question for an innovation person, because I guess it continually evolves, right? And it's one of the reasons I love to work in this industry. And but what stays core and fundamental, and I think one of the reasons I've been able to be successful in this role, is the core need for marketing is to engage consumers, and that never changes. What changes is how we go about it. And I think recently marketing's become more complex, more competitive, and more reactive than ever before. And it's also so technology, data driven, personalized. And we're seeing this seismic shift from, intrusive, ill-targeted advertising to the need for brands to be more utility focused and more inspirational. And I think, this shift has meant that for brands, we need to understand better when and why and how we can bring value to a particular moment. And we have to really kind of shape and create experiences for each one of those. Because there's now huge accountability on marketing, there's huge eyes on marketing, and there's a huge need to deliver real value.
And I guess with that kind of lens, I'd just love to ask you, you mentioned about how marketing's become a bit more reactive, perhaps, and a bit more short term. It seems to have been in a bit of a macro trend, really, about the pressure on accountability, driving short termism, the need to have immediate impact. Is that creating a bit of a challenge for clients who need to look forwards, to spend time thinking about the future rather than just the next quarter's target? Is that a real challenge?
I think the marketer's job has got harder than ever, for sure. There are more things they need to know about. There are more things they need to be informed on. And I think previously a marketer was able to be much more of a generalist, and the level of technical and data ability needed to understand the complexity of this world is really hard for a marketer. And I think, what I've started to see, and certainly the clients that we work on, the clients that are successful tend to know the balance and the need between, that reactive spending 90-80% even, with their job on the stuff that they need to do immediately, and 20% really focusing on the future. And obviously I would pitch for it to be much more future focused if you're going to drive true disruption. But I think, the realities of the day-to-day of a CMO's role mean that 10-20% focused on the future allows enough time.
And what's the best way, do you think, of spending that time? I mean, I guess another way of framing that question is, because there's so much noise out there about so many different new possibilities and technology, how do you separate signal from noise to advise your clients in the right way?
I think for a CMO, they have to have just really smart advisors around them and know, that they trust them. And I think, like we talked about earlier, being prepared to test and learn and play in that space starts to separate out the noise very quickly, and you start to understand, which technologies are going to be successful and which ones aren't, and which advisors you can begin to trust and which you can't. I'm sure every agency right now is out there pitching NFTs for their clients, and what their role is in metaverse and conversational experiences. But if it doesn't go back to the value that it creates for their customers, then we've got it wrong as innovation experts. And so that's really where we start, is the insight from the customers, and apply those future trends and future thinking to start experimenting with them.
And I'd love to come back to that sort of specific technology, actually, if I may, because there's so much noise around, particularly now, around NFTs, the metaverse, and so on. But let's take NFTs, because I know you've done, as Wavemaker, a number of interesting projects in this space. And so, and you wrote a really interesting piece about the value that NFTs potentially have for brands. And part of what you were talking about there is how, it's the interesting platform that it can create beyond perhaps just digital art. So the idea of membership, tickets, an NFT can make you an investor, a member of a club. I think you wrote a shareholder of a brand, part of a loyalty program. Tell me a bit more about what you see the role of NFTs being for brands.
So I guess NFTs can essentially change the nature of your consumer relationship eventually. I think I think from an NFT experience and partnership standpoint, they can become kind of real engines for both kind of paid, owned and communications. And I think one of the ways that they can start to do that is they give people an ownership of your brand. They give something to hold on to, and they make people feel like they are a part of a community. And for me, when I'm exploring this space, I think loyalty is probably one of the biggest opportunities to play in this area. You know, how you start to think about loyalty differently by using tokens and DAOs to really kind of build up that that participation in your brand.
Yeah, I think you spoke recently, I think, at a Future of Brands event, and you mentioned about that community aspect. And you actually said, I think, that now it's community first rather than brand first.
Yeah.
So tell me a bit more about what you meant by that.
So I think, you know, I think previously brands have been able to very much dictate the conversation, and kind of how I talked about earlier, you know, brands were very much able to put something out there as a loud message and hope that they start kind of seeing revenues and growth in their business. And I think it's no longer, you know, the possibility to do that, because people aren't engaging in advertising in the same way. And those kind of smaller communities and those micro communities are where people are spending time and engaging. And to be able to, as a brand, you know, really engage in those, you have to be so authentic. You have to add real value to those communities. And so it's going to be driven by the community as to your level of engagement and the participation. And so if you want to be heard, if you want to be seen, then you need to be able to engage in the right level in those communities.
So is part of this just the ability to use NFTs to create that kind of membership, if you like, so that you perhaps have access to exclusive benefits or, you know, products or services or whatever over time? Is that really, you see, being one of the main benefits really for consumers and brands?
Yeah, I mean, it is absolutely, for me, where I believe NFTs lie. You know, it's membership, it's loyalty, it's getting to people to feel like they're an exclusive part of your club, essentially. And the hope is obviously it lives up across platform, across different virtual worlds, the ability to be able to scale this wherever people are, you know, a way to engage in real life, you know, with POAPs and people proving that they attended your events, through to, you know, the ability to join your community and collect things that you as a brand put out there. It's a way to belong, essentially, and a way to drive new loyalty.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think some of the best examples I've seen of are exactly like that, or else they've enabled perhaps people to have access to you know, extended experience of some kind. I think there was actually an interesting one from Live Nation, who had an NFT, I think it was called Live Stubs, where it was an NFT which is associated with your seat that you've actually bought in the concert. And that gives you exclusive access to, you know, material from the artist, and, you know, things that actually come from the artist that they've been to see, which actually makes a lot of sense as a kind of use for an NFT for me. So I'd love to ask also about the other side of this, perhaps, which is about maybe creators and influencers, because I think you spoke at the Future of Brands event about how it could be useful for monetization for those communities. And maybe what's the role of brands in this? How can brands be involved in that territory?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think it's such murky water right now, and where brands have previously been able to keep that control, you know, how their brand shows up, what their brand looks like, is increasingly becoming less likely that they'll be able to do that, right? And I think it gives an incredible opportunity for that authenticity and that brand to stay true to their community, because it's communities that will gain the value from it. So it could be, you know, for example, the creators thinking about R&D and what the future of the product starts to look like, and designing, you know, NFTs and virtual worlds for your particular brand. You know, they're the ones who are going to be driving that engagement, because we're living in these micro communities, right? You know, I don't know what your morning is like, but mine is generally about answering 20 different Discord groups, about 10 different WhatsApp groups, and we're in this bubble, and it's even worse the younger you are, I think, because there's about 40 different micro platforms. But I think it's going to be increasingly more likely that creators and your brand advocates are going to take control of your brand and how they perceive your brand, which means as a brand, it's about giving creators the tools and the ability to go out and do that.
Okay, brilliant. And we're talking a lot already about the future, but I would like to ask a bit about your prediction, really, for perhaps the future of marketing and advertising. So perhaps it's about NFTs, or perhaps it's about something else. But what would your prediction be?
Again, asking an innovation person for one prediction is hard, but I think probably the most topical and the most interesting to me is the future being virtual first. And I think the reason I wanted to talk about this one is because I, as a marketer, and the marketers that I talk to often struggle with the concept of a virtual first world, because it's so far removed from the current world, from the world that we grew up in. But Generation Alpha are moving much more towards shared experiences on platform. And like we just talked about, as brands, we need to be where they're spending time. I mentioned my 7-year-old, he is only 7 and he spends his time with his friends playing FIFA online. And he engages in this micro community through experience and private messaging. And, it's his form of social, and social media for Generation Alpha is not going to be necessarily TikTok. That will be quick trend-led social, probably, fast eyeballing, but those cultural moments and those really big times for them will happen in these communities on platforms like FIFA, on Fortnite, on Discord. And I think as brands, that's where we will be able to really kind of build that loyalty and lifetime value. And so out of all the predictions, I think that one probably is the trend that is most real, is already happening. And, we as marketers really need to stand up and pay attention to.
And gaming is quite a challenging area, isn't it? Or has been, really, for brands to engage with. And you mentioned about authenticity and things. I mean, it's a real challenge to put a brand message into that environment in a way that is non-interruptive, that actually works in that kind of connects into the kind of community in the right kind of way. So, I mean, how do you think brands can really do this? Have you seen great examples, or what's the way in which they can enter that kind of space?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, but actually it's the best kind of challenge, because when you do get that advocacy, it's so much more meaningful than, the passive engagement that you get, from necessarily just putting some kind of form of digital advertising out there. I heard a great story actually around Disney. I don't even know if this is true, so it might be rumor, but when they were developing Disney Plus, they couldn't understand why the passwords were so long when people were signing up to Disney. And they realized it was children setting up the accounts. And by writing password must be 6 characters or more, the children were putting Elsa, Woody, Buzz Lightyear in, not understanding the character element of it. And to me, that's just a great example of, thinking about things user first, and really understanding your user base, who they are, where they want your brand to appear. KitKat did a great integration, actually. I'm very enviable of it. And it was essentially a game integration that, by essentially using the KitKat, it gave you a break from the game, and the game didn't normally allow you to break. So it's real utility and value to those users, and it gets them to engage with your product in a much more meaningful way. So everything has to go back to know your audience, spend time with them, don't just stick a banner ad in a game, Obviously scale, but scale something meaningful, scale an experience.
And I'd love to ask you a bit more about the metaverse, because there's so much talk about this at the moment, and yet it feels like quite an ill-defined concept or thing. So in your view, what is the metaverse, and what does it look like and feel like, and actually how can brands really engage in meaningful ways in that?
So the metaverse essentially is been defined in lots of different ways, and I think it's a collection of all of those different definitions. And I think the reason it's a collection is because it's a future vision. Like, let's start with that, right? Like, nobody really knows what it is or what it will become. So I try not to get too hung up on the definitions of what it is or what it isn't. And I pretty much sum it up to it being a virtual world where people can socialize and spend time in. And, I think one of the things that puts off marketers, or certainly as a challenge, is the complexities that exist with the future vision of the internet, the technologies such as blockchain and crypto that are the fundamental building blocks to these technologies. But I think if you just strip it back and go back to, these environments are places where people are going to spend time in virtual worlds. How do you start thinking about engaging in that, and what's the role to play in that? Because it is a vision right now. So,
and I think I've seen lots of examples of brands sort of setting up space like Nightland in Roblox, and Chipotle, I think, have done some stuff as well, like a virtual restaurant and things. Do you think that is quite a good approach to just create a space and then just use it to test and learn and to find out what works, what engages, what doesn't?
Depends on what their insight is for them doing that, right? I mean, I think there are some examples where it clearly does drive engagement, and I think it comes down to that individual brand and what it is that they're trying to do. We're quietly testing and learning with a few brands and building experiences with them, and we're learning some really interesting things. One thing we learned from an activation was the idea that actually people want to buy an NFT to then activate it in the physical world isn't actually happening, and is too long a process for people. People want an NFT that they can generally activate in that virtual world that they're in at the time. And it might not be true for all of the different platforms, but certainly the platform that we tested on. And, I wouldn't broadly say it's a great activation, because I'm not sure building a virtual world, for a brand, it's a big investment. It's a big way to go. So you have to have some pretty strong insight that would lead you to do that.
And one of the things I think is interesting about how the space is emerging at the moment is there seems to be a kind of a different approach between, I guess, what you might call sort of user-led spaces and communities, and those which are more corporate, I suppose, through like Meta and so on, which are quite sort of corporate-driven approaches, creating their own kind of versions of what the metaverse is like. Do you think there'll be a winner out of that? Do you think that one of those will win out, or?
I'm gonna be controversial probably here. I think when you look at the Web 1 brands that made it to Web 2, the Netscapes of the world, it was very unlikely that those Web 1 brands would ever make it to Web 2, because their entire identity was built on the building blocks of Web 1. And I kind of feel the same way about Web 3, right? I think when you're building something off a base that is built in Web 2, it's very hard to change the way that you operate. So you have to disrupt your entire business model, your entire thinking. And I think, some of the things that have been put out maybe, show some of those brands as a little bit legacy moving into this space potentially. So I don't know. My general feeling is the Web 3 brands of tomorrow, we might not even know who they are yet. It's highly unlikely, I think, that it will be the big players of today.
And do you think, because there's obviously the interesting thing of being able to trade, in the metaverse and in sort of virtual environments, things like virtual clothing, and do you think we'll see, or have we seen already perhaps, virtual brands, brands that only exist in the virtual world and don't exist in physical form at all?
Yeah, I know that there were quite a few that showed up in Decentraland around Fashion Week. I think what's interesting is the digital first brands starting to move into physical. So Bored Ape Yacht Club, for example, opening up a restaurant. And I think I think we're going to start to see a bit of a switch, which will be really, really interesting. I don't know. I think there's always a place to play in virtual and physical environments. And I think it's important that, we show up where our users are and where our customers are. And most of the time they spend time in both.
I think, as you were talking there about that example, I think one of the things I was thinking of was about direct to consumer brands, actually, and the parallels there, because a number of those brands started out as completely sort of digital only brands, of course, and they built their kind of business early on doing that. But then over time, as they've matured, they've started to look more and more like traditional brands, using traditional above the line media, offline media, but also retail outlets and so on. Do you think that's a kind of a path which perhaps this space will see as well, like you said there, that they will actually start out as virtual only brands, but then ultimately it's inevitable at some point that they will have some physical form and they'll start to look more like traditional brands? Is that an inevitability, do you think?
I don't know if they'll start to look like traditional brands, because I think, even traditional brands are evolving how they show up in physical spaces, right? Like take the Coca-Cola store, experience store as a prime example. I hope what we'll start to see is new experiences start to emerge in physical that are driven by these new digital first brands. So I really hope that is what we will see. I don't think that they will start to show up in the same traditional ways. I think they challenge thinking the way that they are at the moment. So I can't see them showing up in that same way.
And I guess one of the perennial kind of challenges or cynical kind of things, I suppose, about new technologies and is, what's the kind of version for maybe, brands, if you're baked beans or if you're, I don't know, shampoo or something like that. How do you get involved with spaces where, you're not Nike or you're not sort of able to do something like Nike Land? What would be the version of that for brands which are perhaps a bit different to that?
Again, I think it goes down to what your core kind of proposition is with your product. If you're a shampoo brand, for example, how do you start showing up in virtual salons? If people are going to be doing their like daily shopping in virtual environments and ordering their groceries through virtual environments, how do you start to appear in that? And I think what we start to see is this kind of effect of meta consumption, which I kind of talk around a little, which is this idea that the attributes of your physical product show up in game. So if you're a shampoo, for example, you start to show up with a shinier hair avatar, or you start to have more confidence in your avatar. And I think it's about really kind of digging into what those product attributes are and the future trends and seeing where the two meet.
And let me ask you as a sort of final question on in this space about what this means for media agencies, because it's such a new space and there are so many emerging possibilities. So what do you think it's going to mean for what media agencies do and how they work with clients?
I think it's going to be really exciting for media agencies because it's new platforms. It's like any evolution, like we talked about Web 1 to Web 2. There's more interesting, more new platforms. There's new opportunities to experiment. And certainly from my standpoint, I've never seen more beta opportunities and test and learn experiments come from platforms before. So I think it's going to, like any evolution, take us to really interesting places and help kind of grow what those platforms might start to look like.
Amazing, thank you. And we're running short on time, unfortunately, but I'd love to ask you my final question, if that's okay, which is about what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that?
Well, Neil, I wish you had asked me why someone watching might want to join our industry. And my answer, hopefully I've shown kind of or talked about how exciting the industry is. But, I think, like I talked about, diversity of views and opinions and new people coming into our industry, I think that's what will make our industry great. And I think, having not come from this industry, I see the value that I bring to the industry, and I see what that diversity of thinking does for our clients. And so I hope people who are thinking about what their career might be, or thinking about a change in career, think about this as an industry, because there are incredible things that I've gained from this industry. It's ever evolving. I effectively get paid to learn, which is the dream job in my book. You get to work with the world's biggest brands. You get empowering culture, and you're in an industry where they invest and develop your skills and your experience. So I wish you'd asked me why someone wanted to join our industry.
Amazing. Amen to what you said there. I think the question of diversity is a really interesting one. I'd just like to sort of dive into that a little bit more, because I did read about, you were talking about one of your innovation heroes, I think, and there was a piece there about, and you mentioned it was Arlen Hamilton, who's the founder of Backstage Capital. And you mentioned about how less than 10% of venture capital deals go to women, multicultural, LGBTQ founders. So it's interesting actually there that diversity is a challenge, not just in perhaps marketing, advertising, but also in venture capital and the investments there. So I guess what's the answer to that? I know there's so many different sort of takes on this, but what do you think is the biggest thing that needs to change
in venture capital, particularly?
Yeah, I guess in terms of making those new ideas a reality, and just some of the new inventions and technologies and innovations that we're seeing, what needs to change there?
I think, like I said, bringing in different people from different backgrounds, having people like Arlen Hamilton. So for anyone who doesn't know her, she started out on the streets in San Francisco, dreaming of becoming a venture capitalist, and from being homeless to becoming one of the most well-respected venture capitalists in Silicon Valley is incredible. And I think the biggest thing that needs to change is openness, and bringing people in from diverse backgrounds, valuing people for their ideas and their creativity and their thoughts, and giving people a chance. I think it is the biggest thing that needs to change. And that will eventually change the diversity and hopefully drive new innovations into new spaces where we all need them most.
And let me just ask you a final question here, because we've talked about quite a lot of different technologies and emerging kind of platforms over the last sort of 40 minutes or so. But I'd love to ask you, out of all of the things that we talked about, and out of all of the innovations which you've got in front of you right now, what do you think is the most exciting?
So I get most excited by future generations and how they're engaging in things. And I think one of the most incredible things about the future generation is their demand for transparency, their demand for authenticity, and the demand for brands to show up in better ways. And I think the new technologies that will allow that, such as virtual worlds, such as digital campfires, such as conversational AI, are the things that get me excited, because I think it has the potential to really change how we communicate as brands.
Brilliant. I love your positivity about the future there. It's a great way to end the session. So my thanks to Sarah Salter. Thank you for being part of Firestarters, Sarah. And,
thanks so much, Neil.
No problem. And don't forget to subscribe, of course, to the videos, and Do share the video if you enjoyed it, and thank you for listening to Google Firestarters. So my thanks again to Sarah. Thank you.